All right. I'm looking forward to this week's Rising Tide Foundation lecture where Adam Sedia will grace us today with a presentation that is very close to my heart. And it's something which not very many people have caught on to, which is that we've been all told a mythology that's, for some reason or another, managed to latch on to the popular imagination, to academia for a very long time, which is really holding back our potential. And if we don't diagnose the qualitative difference between these two moments in history, these two periods in history, we are really in for some deep trouble for many generations. And what I'm speaking about right now is this notion that the Enlightenment evolved organically from the earlier incarnation called the Renaissance. And that's something, again, that's been repeated. Many thousands, if not millions, of books and commentaries have been written about the natural evolution of the Enlightenment as the next phase of the Renaissance. And evidence shows, for anybody who's honest, that that is bunk. It's not true. It's deceitful. It's misguided. And Adam is among the few people I know who has really dug into that question. And today we'll be presenting in a lot more thorough detail what makes these two periods, these two moments, they're not even moments, these two movements so very different, and why the Renaissance principle is something we should definitely look back to if we're going to be able to plot out a pathway to the future that's worth living in, and why traps are beset all around Enlightenment paradigms that are just so fallaciously composed, but they're everywhere. So I'm excited. Adam, like usual, when you're done your main presentation, I know you got some slides to share and everything, but we'll step back and have a little dialogue with the live audience. And everybody who's the live audience, just put your name in the chat box and I will call upon you to ask Adam a question. So, Adam, it's all yours.
Well, thank you, Matt, and thank you for the opportunity to present this. This was a piece I had written probably a couple years ago now in the New Lyre, and it was recently rerun and fortuitously got Matt's attention. And this is a subject near and dear to me, too. When we think of the word enlightenment, it's not like Renaissance. Renaissance simply means, I have a large Canadian audience here, so you'll know you're French. It means simply rebirth. And the Renaissance we talk about in Europe was one of many. In ancient Egypt, you had the Saite Renaissance of the 26th dynasty. In the Byzantine Empire, you had the Macedonian Renaissance of the 9th or the 10th and 11th century. In China, you had several Renaissances like the Tang, the Song, and the Ming dynasties. So it's sort of a neutral term. It simply means a rebirth. Enlightenment doesn't have that neutrality. It implies a value judgment that what was before is ignorance and what is afterwards is realization of truth, similar to the Buddhist concept of enlightenment. And that couldn't be further from the truth. And in fact, in most ways, the European Enlightenment is a reaction against the Renaissance and a rejection of the Renaissance values. So I want to get into what the Renaissance is, both how it came about and what its values were. And then I'm going to get into the Enlightenment, contrast them, and then sort of talk about where we are today and what we need is the Renaissance and not the Enlightenment. So when we talk about the Renaissance, we really mean a rebirth of the classical worldview. Well, what does that mean? Ancient Greece and Rome, what is the classical worldview? So Greek philosophy, we start with the pre-Socratics, which was an understanding of the universe as natural rather than supernatural causes, an exploration for natural meaning and rational explanation of the phenomenon rather than spiritual or supernatural. And we have philosophers like Thales of Miletus, Anaximander, Democritus, Anaxagoras, who made some pretty remarkable scientific breakthroughs for their time in the 6th and 5th century BC. And then we have Socrates and afterwards, which it was human-focused philosophy. What is the life worth living? What is the purpose of life? What does it mean to be good and moral beyond just following divinely outlined precepts? An exploration of the human mind. What does it mean to know? We have what is being, what is existence. We have the three fields of philosophy: ontology, epistemology, ethics, being developed almost all at once out of Socratic philosophy. We have Plato's concept of the ideal, the one, the soul, the Aristotelian concept of the single God and the ordered universe. All of these are Greek ideas, which then, when Rome adopted them, first Alexander the Great's conquest spread them through the Eastern Mediterranean, and then Rome spread them throughout the Mediterranean world. In the first few centuries AD, this combined with Hebrew monotheism in the form of Christianity. And what that did is it gave a narrative arc to history. Our existence has a purpose. There's time and history have a rational unfolding and a central point, and our being has a meaning and a purpose. And St. Paul, and especially St. John in his gospel, with the opening of the word logos, that is fundamentally a Greek term. It's usually translated as the word. In the beginning was the word. Well, logos has a broader meaning. I would translate it something as cosmic order. And that transferred Hebrew theology into the context of Greek philosophy, and it began the marriage of those two traditions. This was a process that was completed in the 4th century with the fusion of Hebraic monotheism, Greco-Roman philosophy. And unfortunately, it lasted only for about a century until the Visigothic sack of Rome in 411. I'll get to that in a second. So the next 1,000 years from that point, again, the traditional, or the not traditional, the common narrative is that there was 1,000-year dark ages, and then all of a sudden people realized what they'd been missing, and this classical culture was reborn. That is not the case at all. In fact, the Middle Ages don't get enough credit. It is a millennium-long history of attempts at reviving the Greco-Roman world. And you can think of it, picture it as a series of steps. There's attempts at step forward, but there's always something dragging backwards in circumstances. And then there's another step forward, and the backsliding is a little less, and then a little less. And then finally we get to the Renaissance in the 15th century. The first real Renaissance was by the Roman Empire itself, under Justinian. It was primarily an attempt at political unity, a series of wars, the Ostrogothic and the Vandal Wars, and he managed to reunify, I'd say, about 2/3 to 3/4 of the old Roman Empire. But what people forget is there was a cultural revival as well. One of Justinian's most lasting achievements was to unify the various and often conflicting sources of Roman law into a single coherent code of law, and that would form an inspiration for, surprisingly enough, the poets of the later Renaissance. And there was an artistic and architectural revival. The Hagia Sophia was inspired by the Pantheon in Rome. It's a little smaller, but it is a remarkable achievement and is still standing a millennium and a half later. And it was directly inspired as a Christian counterpart to the glory of the old pagan architecture. And then, of course, we have the beautiful mosaics in San Vitale in Ravenna and the lost Great Palace in Constantinople as testament to the artistic achievement of the day. But unfortunately, it was cut short. We had the volcanic winter of 536 and the following plague and famine. The wars he undertook to number one, to achieve the political unity, and then to fight his rival, arch rival, Khosrau I of Persia, uh, cost the empire more than it could afford in manpower and money. And then after his death, everything fell apart. You had the Avar and Slavic invasions, the Ostrogothic invasion of Italy, the Arab conquest of Syria, Egypt, North Africa, and it ended everything that had been accomplished almost. As a side note, during the next 200 years, there was Constans II, who was emperor from 641 to 668, would be the last reigning emperor to visit Rome itself, and he wanted to move his capital to Syracuse in an attempt to push the empire westward and regain the territories Justinian had won, but he was assassinated before he could achieve that. During the interlude, in 751, the Pope, Zachary at the time, authorized the deposition of the Frankish king Childeric III by his mayor of the palace, Pepin, and gave authority recognition to Pepin to become king. And in exchange, Pepin promised he would protect the papacy in lieu of the Eastern emperors who no longer could afford to protect the papacy as their traditional patron. Pepin's grandson Charlemagne pushed the Frankish kingdom in wars with the Saxons and the Avars and the Caliphate, and then the Lombards into a kingdom that occupies most of what is now France, Germany, and Italy. And then famously, Pope Leo III crowned him Holy Roman Emperor on Christmas Day of the year 800 in a statement to the world that this was the Western, Rome was reborn in the West. The empire now was reborn in the West because the East was no longer powerful enough to protect Rome. But as part of this, there was the Carolingian Renaissance, which was a cultural revival and perhaps the most important of these medieval renaissances. In 789, Charlemagne issued the Admonitio Generalis, which was a law in 82 chapters. A large chunk of it was geared toward clerical reform, but part of that, it required establishing monasteries, rather, to establish schools to teach literacy, music, and theology. And what this led to was a copying of manuscripts. In fact, the oldest manuscripts we have today that weren't discovered independently come from the Carolingian Renaissance. And we owe this period much of the preservation of the literature of Greece and Rome. And as you can see here from this manuscript, there's a revival of classical aesthetic and an architectural revival in a very Byzantine Romanesque style. This is the cathedral at Aachen, Charlemagne's capital. Charlemagne's son Louis the First kept the empire united, but when he died, he followed the Frankish custom of dividing the realm between his three sons, and then the result was dynastic feud and eventual loss of much of the progress of the Carolingian Renaissance. Less than a century later, however, we have our third attempt, the Ottonian Renaissance. In 936, Otto of Saxony was elected German king, and the papacy at the time had been reduced to just a plaything among squabbling Roman families. So to set the church in order, Otto crossed the Alps in the first of what would be many expeditions. He conquered the kingdom of Italy from the last of the Carolingians and settled the feuds between the Roman families. And he was crowned Holy Roman Emperor in 962 and revived much of Charlemagne's efforts to copy the manuscripts and continue education. The decrees were pretty much put back into effect after being ignored. Um, Interestingly enough, he also bridged the division with the East as well, and reached out to the Byzantine emperor, which at the time it was undergoing the Macedonian Renaissance, named for the dynasty that ruled it, which it involved its own flurry of copying manuscripts and reviving classical aesthetic. He married his son, the eventual Otto II, to the Byzantine princess Theophano. You can see in the middle their wedding done in Byzantine style. And not coincidentally, the earliest Greek manuscripts in the West come from this time. She had brought them from Constantinople. And then the Byzantine artistic styles influenced the West. You can see Otto II on the right here, in for the Middle Ages, a very realistic and naturalistic depiction. After the death of Otto III in 1002, we have again something of a loss, not as dramatic as after the Carolingian Renaissance. And again, it would be just a bit less than 200 years later, we would have another Renaissance. This would be the last attempt at political unification by one of the most interesting figures in history, the Emperor Frederick II. He became king of Sicily at the age of 4 in 1198, but it was a highly cultured court. It had a heavy Byzantine and Arab influence. He himself was a polymath. He spoke 6 languages, was very interested in philosophy and poetry, and something of a free thinker for his day. In 1220, he inherited the Holy Roman Empire from his grandfather, and as you can see, he wanted to unite the two realms, and what stood in his way was the papacy. And this launched a very contentious war he had with the papacy. He himself was excommunicated 4 times, including by an ecumenical council. The King of France came to the aid of the Pope, and this was the origin of the Guelph and Ghibelline parties in Italy, the Guelphs supporting the papacy, the Ghibellines the emperor. As far as policy goes, he himself, it was turned to classic Roman law and Roman tradition for his inspiration. In 1231, well, he founded a university. We'll get to that in a second. But in 1231, he issued a decree called the Liber Augustalis, which would remain in effect in Italy for the next 600 years. And it was remarkable for its time. It banned trial by ordeal and trial by battle. It asserted the primacy of written over customary law. And then it affirmed the Roman concept of equality of all persons before the law. It was really ahead of its time, and it would form a model for later legislation. And Frederick was on the verge of success, but he died after a sudden illness in 1250, and his minor heirs didn't have the wherewithal to pick up his efforts. And within 20 years, his dynasty had ended, and the popes gave Naples and Sicily to a branch of the French royal family as a thank you for supporting them. At the same time, though, that we have this, while the top-down attempt at political reunification would ultimately fail, we have this bottom-up Renaissance that would directly lead into the Italian Renaissance a century later. We have the establishment of the great universities, starting with Bologna in 1088. And you can see these are, say what you want about them today, these are historically the powerhouses of learning that preserved and expanded Western knowledge. We have the architectural innovation that led to the ability to build the high and wide Gothic cathedrals we see, rather than the somewhat cramped and dark Romanesque cathedrals earlier. This is the Royal Chapel in France, and some of the more notable cathedrals are listed there. We also have a rebirth of philosophy with scholasticism. starting with Saint Anselm of Canterbury in 10th, who lived in the 11th century, and eventually reaching Saints Bonaventure, Albert the Great, and Thomas Aquinas. Another key event of this time was Ferdinand III of Castile conquered Cordoba from the Arabs in 1236. Now, Cordoba had been the capital of the Islamic Caliphate, and the caliphs there had assembled a large library because they wanted to rival Constantinople and Baghdad. Well, when the Castilians got a hold of this library, Ferdinand's son Alfonso X, the Wise, had all the manuscripts copied and sent throughout Europe, especially to Paris. This was the first time many Greek manuscripts, including Aristotle, made their appearance in the West. And Aristotle would make a huge impact on Thomas Aquinas's iteration of scholasticism at the time. And I would say that this bottom-up Renaissance was the true beginning of what would become the Italian Renaissance. Right around the end of this time, in the late 13th century, we have Dante Alighieri, we have Petrarch, and we have Boccaccio, the three crowns of Italian literature. I'll get to them in more detail in a second, but they come from this time. Petrarch and Boccaccio especially had a hobby. They were friends, and they would go around to various monasteries and look for manuscripts that hadn't been copied yet. And they uncovered many undiscovered works, but this would not have been possible without the earlier attempts at preserving these manuscripts. Many poets of this time, too, Albertino Mussato in Padua, revived the Roman title of poet laureate, but he was actually a lawyer, and so were a lot of other poets. They were inspired by Justinian's code as a model of reason and order, and they saw in that a model for moral governance. And then in painting, also from this time, these are contemporaries of Dante and Petrarch from the late 13th, early 14th centuries. We have Giotto, Taddeo Gaddi, and then in sculpture we have Arnolfo di Cambio, and then not shown here is Cimabue, another painter. These turned away from Byzantine models and focused on three-dimensional naturalistic depictions in which the viewer is made part of the scene. And this scene of the betrayal of Judas by Giotto is particularly striking. This is around the year 1300, and here we get a sense of being actually in the scene. Unfortunately, and then I should add during this time too, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles IV made an incursion into Italy and was so impressed by what he saw, he wanted to take it back to Prague, his own capital. He founded a university there, the Charles University, which is still around. And he was the first monarch to carry the Renaissance out of Italy into the rest of Europe. And it wasn't just him. Hungary, which might be a surprise to some, had strong dynastic ties with Naples and trading ties with Venice. And they adopted Renaissance culture very early. And then the Kingdom of Aragon in Spain acquired Sicily in 1285 and transferred much of the culture there too. So not just in Italy, we start seeing the beginnings of the Renaissance in the rest of Europe as well. This was cut short, however, by the Black Plague of 1346 to 1353. There was political crisis too. The Pope left Rome in 1309. We had the Avignon papacy. When the Pope moved back to Rome in 1376, the French king didn't support that and nominated his own pope, and we had the schism in the Western Church for 50 years. And then we had the Hundred Years' War between England and France going on at the same time. These conflicts dragged all of Europe in with it, particularly the schism. Some some kingdoms would look towards Avignon, others Rome, that served as a source of conflict. Then we had an attempt at revival that led to a third pope in Pisa. Um, all the progress of the late 13th, early 14th century was lost. However, everything resolved itself in after the Black Plague. Um, even in tragedy, there sometimes comes good, and that's what happened here. After the Black Plague, there was a large opportunity for social mobility. There was a lot of work that needed to be done and very few people who needed to do it, and that would lead to increased economic activity, especially in northern Italy. The same thing with the Crusades. Um, Tragic as they were, it opened up interest in the East and in trade routes, and a lot of not just cultural exchange, but goods wound their way through Italy, with Venice, Genoa, and Pisa uh, assuming the primary role of transporting the goods, luxury goods from the East into Europe. This made northern Italy rather, fabulously wealthy, and the local lords, the Visconti and Sforza of Milan, the Gonzaga of Mantua, and then the Medici of Florence, who uniquely started out as commoners, as bankers, and would eventually become lords of Florence, um, found themselves awash in money. And to do that, to aggrandize themselves, uh, patronized the arts. So the artistic revival that had started now found new life. Same thing happened with the papacy. The Council of Constance ended the schism in 1415, and we had a new revitalized papacy in Rome. Popes Eugene IV, Nicholas V, and Pius II were generous patrons of the arts and massive supporters of the Renaissance. Nicholas V expanded the Vatican Library into one of the largest in the world. And Pius II was himself a poet and a humanist who was extremely interested in uncovering classical manuscripts. And then we had the Council of Florence from 1431 to 1445. It affected a second union between the Greek Orthodox and Catholic churches, and many Greek clerics and even the emperor himself went to Florence, and they brought manuscripts with them, attracting scholars from all across Europe and introducing another influx of Greek manuscripts. So from this time forward, this is the height of the Renaissance. There would be a going back, but I'll get into that. This is the Renaissance we think of. This was the Renaissance that would spread to the rest of Europe. And it spread to the rest of Europe through tragedy. Charles VIII of France invaded Italy in 1494 to aid the Duke of Milan against the Venetians. And the invasion was a disaster for Italy. Although the Italian city-states were rich and culturally powerful, they were militarily weak, and this was revealed. So it launched a series of foreign invasions, French, Spanish, and German, that would eventually result in Italy losing its independence for the next 400 years about. But Charles was so impressed by the cultural flourishing he saw there, he wanted to bring it back to Paris. And he imported Italian artists and scholars, and famously Leonardo da Vinci was he went to Paris where he died. And with France adopting the Renaissance, the rivals of the French king, the Emperor Maximilian I and Henry VIII of England, also wanted to make their own capital centers of Renaissance culture, copying Charles IV from the 1300s. So This was the dissemination of the final and most thorough dissemination of the Renaissance outside of Italy. So I want to talk now, before I get on to moving towards the Enlightenment, what was the Renaissance? What was special about it? And the key concept to think about here is the imago viva Dei, the living image of God. This has its roots it's a Christian concept with its roots in Genesis, where God creates man in his image and likeness. Now, the Renaissance philosophers and theologians agree this can't be a physical likeness because God is infinite and we are not. Instead, this is man as both a rational and a creative being. And then by investigating the intricacies of the cosmos and of nature and of mankind, i.e., science and art, this strengthens and clarifies man's relationship with his creator and brings him closer to his creator. In classical aesthetics and art, we have the transition to classical models. This isn't a break from Christian artistic tradition, but a shift in perspective. The Byzantine models are two-dimensional, but they're aesthetic and allegorical. They convey an impression of the divine as something beyond mortal. Because eternity is outside of time, angels and saints are shown in stasis of perfect serenity and bliss. No movement, they're outside of time, they're immortal, no sense of the flesh. This is a conceptual depiction. With the idea of the imago viva Dei, the idea of man, it depicts human figures as they are in their temporality and mortality. But to the Renaissance mind, this was neither idolatry nor a rejection of the divine, but a depiction of the divine as manifested in creation. In this way, classical aesthetic informed the Christian worldview and vice versa. And here we see some examples. This Fra Lippo Lippi piece, I think, is stunning. We have dramatic use of perspective. This is a scene of the Virgin and Child with Saint Anne, the Virgin's mother, in the background. We have a clear foreground and a background. We have natural depiction. We have a domestic scene as how people of the day would have looked. We have Mantegna's famous Saint Sebastian, a religious subject, but depicted in classical semi-nudity with a classical background, with the Corinthian column, the ruins that the people of the day would have actually seen. And then we have non-religious works too. We have the birth of Botticelli's famous Birth of Venus from classical mythology. And then one of the most, almost cliche works, the Mona Lisa, but it really is remarkable. It has what's called sfumato, the sort of blurriness, and then the smile, the depiction of the smile is what has attracted commentary ever since it was first painted. A realistic depiction of a soul behind the figure. Architecture, we have the same concept here. We have Brunelleschi's Duomo in Florence. He relied on classical model. He examined the Pantheon, but expanded on it through his study of geometry to build something new. And in fact, this would be the largest dome in the world until 1871. And then we have Alberti built, this is one of his churches. He built many across northern Italy. And then Donato Bramante and Michelangelo both contributed to the architecture of St. Peter's Basilica. And again, all of these are religious architecture with clear inspiration in classical aesthetics, where we have perspective, proportion, all based on nature. The phenomena in nature, like the golden ratio, played into these buildings importantly, and they, as temples of God, reflect the creation of God, with symmetry and proportion. Literature, too. Here we have, from left to right, Dante, Boccaccio, and Petrarch. What they did was create a literature in a new language. In the Middle Ages, Latin was the only language with grammar and rules. The Germanic and English languages were foreign, and the Romance languages were just considered bad Latin. So if you were going to write in proper grammar, the only language you could do that in was Latin. And so study of Latin, um, not just the church, but the legal and medical professions, you used Latin. But Latin was not a living language. No one spoke it. In fact, you could say the Romance languages were what Latin had become. Starting with the court of Frederick II, where the sonnet was developed in the vernacular as a love song, these three gentlemen here elevated Italian, the common Italian, the Tuscan Italian, to the level of a literary language by writing poetry and prose. And what they did, whereas Latin lacked immediacy and connection to daily experience, Dante, Boccaccio, and Petrarch elevated the vernacular into a literary language and allowed expression of literary subjects, abstract ideas in the living language of the day, creating growth for the spoken language and artistic expression that bridge the gap between the abstract and the everyday. But that doesn't mean that they rejected Latin. Petrarch and Boccaccio especially were committed to the preservation of Latin literature, hence their interest in manuscripts. And not just them, Poggio Bracciolini, Marsilio Ficino, Enea Silvio Piccolomini, who would become Pope Pius II, and then the German Nicholas of Cusa, who we'll talk about again, and Cardinal Bessarion, one of the Greek clerics who came from Constantinople to Florence and actually stayed in Italy. All of them were committed to the preservation and study of classical literature. And this was known as humanism. This isn't humanism as we use it today in the sense of atheistic materialism. It's the study of humanity, humanitatis, mankind. This includes grammar, rhetoric, history, poetry, and moral philosophy. It's a cultural movement, not an ideology. And as you can expect, the next step from literature is philosophy. Renaissance humanism revived the Greek ideal of intellectual freedom and individual expression as virtues. Medieval scholasticism focused on expounding moral philosophy based on scripture taken as revealed truth. Renaissance humanism addressed the individual's moral and intellectual development. And again, it was not a rejection of scholasticism or of Christian moral theology. It was viewing it through a new lens supplied by the classical world. We have Pico della Mirandola's On Human Dignity, which is a very individualistic work, rather. And on the far left here, we have Machiavelli. Now, he's unfortunately best known for his very practical and realistic The Prince, but he has another less known work, Discourses on Livy, where he discusses individual virtues of the ideal Republican statesman. You can think of The Prince as the practical guide and Discourses on Livy as the idealistic guide. Nicholas of Cusa, probably the most important figure we'll discuss here. He was a German, was also present at Florence. His famous work is from 1440, De Docta Ignorantia. And he posits that the moral nature of man inherently limits his ability to comprehend an infinite God. This is from Aristotle and from the scholastics, whereas Aristotle viewed finite man and infinite God having an unbridgeable gap between them. Cusa turned to Christian theology, in which the eternal God becomes a finite man in the single person of Jesus Christ, and said that, well, if that gap can be bridged, there is the model for bridging the gap between finite and infinite. It's a coincidence of opposites, he says. And so while reason alone can't bridge that gap, creativity can. Um, Becoming acquainted with the divine spark within oneself, man gains a hint, an idea of the nature of the divine. And as a corollary of that, without knowing the divine within oneself, one cannot observe it in others or in the universe generally. In other words, realizing the universe requires self-realization. Um, a remarkable focus on the individual, and Cusa was a I think he was a cardinal. He was a cleric. He was a churchman. So he was operating clearly within Orthodox small o uh, theology, Christian theology. None of the Renaissance humanists ever rejected Christianity. They upheld Christian moral teaching, and they took great pains to identify the virtues of the pagan philosophers with the Christian moral teaching. The last two figures here are Erasmus of Rotterdam, who he was Dutch. You know, he lived 1466 to 1536, so after the Italian phase of the Renaissance, but he was called the Prince of Humanists. And his friend and correspondent, Thomas More, the Lord Chancellor of England, later sainted in the Catholic Church, both of them advocated for a humanistic reading of Scripture and for humanist values informing Christian theology. And they called for internal reforms within the church. And this will get to the bridge we have between the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. Um, my thesis might be a little controversial here, but the Reformation was actually a reaction against the Renaissance. Um, the poorer northern populations, distant from Rome, distant from the wealth and the culture of the Renaissance, reacted against it. They saw the revival of classical aesthetics and teaching as pagan and idolatrous. And while Erasmus was a harsh and often caustic critic of church corruption, he saw the avenue humanism as a source of internal reform. What we got instead in the North was a reaction against that. With Luther, his idea, well, Luther in Germany and Zwingli in Switzerland, coincidentally in the same year, both arrived at their sola scriptura argument, which interestingly enough would have made no sense without the printing press. Before the printing press, all books had to be produced on parchment, and the Bible, as we know, is a very voluminous work. So they were hard to produce and massively expensive. And as mentioned, the only language with rules was Latin, so they were always in Latin. So just from the sheer unavailability of the written word, uh, the teaching was entrusted to the organization of the church. The invention of the printing press popularized spread production of scripture beyond monastic copying, and the idea of sola scriptura grew directly out of that. But philosophically, it's an ultimate appeal to authority. The text of the Bible is paramount, and no reasoning can countervail its force. This rejects the long tradition of debate of the early councils of the church, and then the scholastic and humanist parsing of scripture after that. And instead, it adopts a literalist and often reductionist reading of the sacred text. Zwingli and Calvin extended this even further, regarding religious art as idolatrous. And what we have throughout Northern Europe at this time, with the spread of the Reformation, we have dissolution of monasteries, with their destruction and the dispersal, or sometimes even outright burning, of their libraries. And then we have mass waves of iconoclasm, particularly in the Netherlands, where sacred art was destroyed as idolatrous. And all of Northern Europe would be preoccupied in this religious embroilment for the next century, and it would culminate in the 30 Years' War from 1619 to 1648, which would kill over half the population of Germany. The Renaissance, however, continued unabated in the Catholic world. We have the Council of Trent from 1545 to 63, which adopted many of the reforms Erasmus advocated for, but it stopped short of endorsing humanist theology. It affirms scholasticism as the official philosophical method of the church, as you will. But part of the Renaissance ideal of understanding the Creator through his creation led to an expansion of science, and the first wave of science from the 16th and 17th centuries is a direct result, outgrowth of that Renaissance idea. We have Nicholas Copernicus, shown here, a Polish church official, first developing the heliocentric theory. Pope Gregory XIII issues his bull Inter Gravissimas in 1582, which reforms the Julian calendar based on astronomical observations. The Vatican at the time was the only European state that had an official observatory, because the date of Easter needed to be calculated through astronomical observations. And as an outgrowth of that, it led to very deep interest in astronomy among the higher clergy. And the Gregorian calendar was developed to be accurate, and I believe it's going to be accurate for something like the next 20,000 years, and maybe even more than that. We have Galileo Galilei. He's known for heliocentrism, but I think that overlooks some of his more impactful discoveries. He investigated gravity and inertia, the principle of relativity. He discovered the moons of Jupiter, the four main moons of Jupiter, and the rings of Saturn. His trial at the end of the life is often used as to show the triumph of superstition over science, but in reality, it was nothing like that. If the church wanted to silence Galileo, they would have killed him a lot sooner, before he undertook his other experiments. What got Galileo in trouble, he advocated heliocentrism as definitively proven when it wasn't, because the Copernican model showed the planets orbiting in circles, and they hadn't yet figured out that the planets in fact orbit in ellipses. So the observations didn't match the theory, and it was still an open question at the time. And Galileo, having had an illustrious career, began to think he was science, and he insulted a lot of powerful officials, which led to him being placed in house arrest in his very comfortable villa. So it wasn't the great conflict of science and superstition that it's been made out to be. Also, we have Tycho Brahe and Johann Kepler, both shown here on the left. Interestingly, both of them were Protestants, but they had to go to the Catholic Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph II to do their work, which they did. Kepler established that the planets orbit the sun in ellipses. Rudolf II was an interesting figure, something of a eccentric and a free thinker. He brought scientists and artists from all over Europe to Prague, and made it a center of culture and learning. And he himself was one of the most liberal sovereigns in Europe at the time, at least as it came to religious practice of religion. He never insisted that either Brahe or Kepler convert, even though they worked for him, which was far from typical for the day. Also, there was the French Jean Rey, who discovered the law of the conservation of mass. And then in the oval, there is Nicholas Steno, who was a Danish Catholic bishop who had to flee to Rome. He was a geologist and first articulated the principles of stratigraphy in geology, which would become important later with the development of geology and geologic history. It was after the Treaty of Westphalia that Protestant Europe caught up, and it did catch up in a big way. On the left is Christian Huygens, who formulated the laws of centrifugal force and the wave theory of light, and he discovered Saturn's moon Titan. In the middle is Gottfried Leibniz, who developed calculus, and the idea of kinetic and potential energy. Not shown is Robert Boyle, who articulated the first formulas for the behavior of gases. And of course, Isaac Newton, who formulated the laws of physics, the laws of motion and gravity, which would be essential to later developments. So by 1690, all of these great leaps of physics, astronomy, mathematics had been achieved. And this owed itself, no small part, to the Renaissance drive to understand the Creator through his creation. Then we have a gap in scientific discovery, and it's during this gap that we have what we call the Enlightenment. Before I get into the Enlightenment, I just want to talk about the state of science a little bit. The afterwards here, we have Volta and Davy and Faraday, Dalton and Berzelius, who really developed modern chemistry and electricity. And after them, you can say the development of science is one continuous story through the 20th century. But during the 18th century, there's not a lot of new discoveries going on. The one exception would be Carl Linnaeus, who was less of a discoverer than a cataloger. He famously traveled the world classifying all living beings and coming up with his binomial system. And his work would have a huge influence later on evolutionary biology and Charles Darwin in particular. Also from this time is the chemist Lavoisier, who did discover hydrogen and oxygen, but beyond that, nothing as groundbreaking as what would come before and after. So from this, we can say that the Enlightenment was not an age of scientific discovery, but an age of philosophical speculation. And that's what we'll go into when we talk about it. The Enlightenment really has its origins during the 30 Years' War. As many historians have observed, the biggest loser of the war was Christianity. Europe had grown tired of arguing about religion, and the philosophy of the day reflects the spirit of an age that no longer took seriously the authority on which the philosophy of prior ages rested. In other words, we couldn't rest on authority of scripture, even for moral propositions. The only thing we could rely on was our own senses, and even those were unreliable. We had to rely on reason. So this is where Descartes really founds modern philosophy. Um, he his discourse on method, 1637, talked about philosophic method, which was to strip away all knowledge acquired through experience. That's what we call a posteriori knowledge, and discover only knowledge that did not depend on external stimuli, which we call a priori knowledge. Truth had to be determined only through a priori knowledge because the senses through which a posteriori knowledge is acquired are limited and therefore unreliable. So Descartes starts with this, I think, therefore I am, and from there rules out everything acquired by a posteriori knowledge to arrive at his conclusions, which are that God exists, that he is good, and then general moral precepts compatible with Christian theology. His contemporary, well, slightly later contemporary, Baruch Spinoza, a Jew living in the Netherlands, adopted the same method, more or less, in a slightly different way. His seminal work in this is The Ethic, which begins with rigid definitions of basic terms and applies the scholastic method to arrive at more detailed conclusions. However, he reaches a radically different conclusion from Descartes. He concludes that God and the universe are one, which we call pantheism, that absolute free will does not exist, but instead it's determined by an infinite chain of events encompassed within the pantheistic God. And in both of these philosophers, we have the birth of modern philosophy. It departs from everything that came before, classical, medieval, and Renaissance. All of these sensed a natural law in which men inherently understood as true. Reason was simply the method of explaining and understanding that truth. What modern philosophy did instead was assume nothing and conclude that whatever truth was whatever the reason led to. And yet we have two radically different conclusions reached by Descartes and Spinoza. And this movement would accelerate through the next century. Under modern philosophy, any investigation into the qualitative nature or metaphysical principles governing the universe was forbidden because it contained knowledge beyond what could strictly be measured and quantified. This idea is best expressed by the radical empiricism of David Hume, a Scottish philosopher. He was even skeptical of the human power to reason inductively, that is, extrapolate a general rule beyond experience or memory. Hume argued simply that instinct rather than reason explained inductive reasoning, with the laws of nature just being shorthand for the summary of human experience. In other words, instead of having to rediscover how the motion of bodies works, we just rely on what's been told to us through a series of observation by everyone else. There is no inductive reasoning. And out of Hume came Immanuel Kant. In his Critique of Pure Reason of 1781, he developed what was called transcendental philosophy. His idea was that any perceived object is nothing more than a bundle of sensation unified in idea, and the thing in itself behind those sensations, or the noumenon, cannot be experienced, because to be experienced, it has to be changed and filtered through the senses. Thus, Kant concluded, we know nothing certain of matter other than that it exists, and any attempt by science or religion to determine ultimate reality can only be a hypothesis. This conclusion, while rigorously reasoned, has its obvious limits because it doesn't address the concept of should and where we get the idea of morals from. So Kant attempted to address this 7 years later in Critique of Practical Reason. Um, his whole theory was that what is morally right is judged according to form rather than substance, i.e., an act is morally right only when it could always hold at the same time as a principle of universal legislation, i.e., it applies to everyone in all places in the same way. He called this the categorical imperative. But it's not grounded in anything beyond its application. In other words, it turns procedure into substance. And this became heavily criticized at the day, notably by Friedrich Schiller. In his letters on aesthetic education, he criticized Kant specifically, and laments that the moral possibility of his age is lacking, were his exact words, and blamed the emphasis on procedure by Kant at the expense of emotion and sentiment. However, it was in France that the Enlightenment philosophy would become most notorious. Voltaire was a ne'er-do-well, a shock jock of sorts. He lacked the rigor of Descartes and Spinoza, but he embraced their um, rejection of any um, overarching moral authority in the universe. And this he satirized Leibniz mercilessly in his novel Candide, and famously inveighed against religions generally and the Catholic Church specifically. Diderot was a similar religious skeptic who got around um, official crackdown by publishing his ideas in the form of an encyclopedia rather than, direct tracts. And famously, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who applied the Cartesian reductionism to social science and said that, well, just as in knowledge, if we need to filter away everything acquired through an experience or tradition, the same thing applies to society. And thus, he postulated that mankind was at his freest in a state of nature, and that the primitive tribes he saw in the Americas and places like that were represented the ideal, and everything else was imposed upon it by uh, irrational and tyrannical structures. Um, his famous quote is, "Man is born free, but everywhere he is in chains." Well, that's a direct outflow of the Cartesian philosophy. And I would add to that the development of anthropology has disproven this notion long ago. Anyone who studies, I'll use the term primitive societies, would know that they are some of the most rigid and in many cases hierarchical structures you can find. Rousseau's ideas were based off of his own perception of what they should be rather than what they actually were. Notably, he never traveled and conducted research in the field. The philosophes especially are sometimes seen as anti-authority or rebels in their way, but that couldn't be further from the truth. They all lived very comfortable lives. Voltaire rubbed shoulders with Frederick the Great, was a frequent dinner guest of his and was celebrated among the courts of Europe. And this brings us to something that is hardly ever discussed, or if it's mentioned in the history books, it's glossed over because it doesn't fit a particular narrative. And this is enlightened despotism. The mania of modern philosophy caught on in a big way among the monarchs of 18th century Europe. And here we have the most famous enlightened despots, shown approximately where their countries are. In order of accession, we have Frederick the Great of Prussia. We have Charles III of Spain, Catherine the Great of Russia, Joseph II of Austria, Gustav III of Sweden. And then we have first ministers who ruled as enlightened despots in the name of their sovereign. We have the Marquis of Pombal in Portugal, one of the earliest and most notorious enlightened despots. We have Johann Struensee in Denmark, who only lasted 2 years before a coup overthrew him. And then Count Bernardo Tanucci in Naples and Sicily. What this was, this looked out at almost a caricature of the scientific view of the world. In other words, God was a clockmaker, a Spinozan view that there's a pantheistic predetermination of events, and God is this clockmaker who sets everything in motion, and everything has its place and its regulation. The enlightened despot viewed the government as the national clockmaker, and everything had its place. So there was a mania for centralization and standardization. In many cases, this did produce good results. In Spain, Charles III updated the antiquated and notoriously inefficient and complicated system that had been in place since the Middle Ages. It resulted in tax and administrative reforms. In Austria, Joseph II abolished serfdom and established compulsory universal education. Torture and cruel forms of execution, like breaking on the wheel or drawing and quartering, were effectively disappeared during this time. Religious policy was a little more complicated. Although religious toleration was a principle of enlightened despotism, often the monarchs came down harder on their own faith or the official faith than they did on minority religions. Catherine the Great infamously seized the lands of the Orthodox Church. And then Pombal, Charles III, and Joseph II all expelled the Jesuit order. And in other countries, in France in particular, the royal court assumed control over appointment of bishops. The Enlightenment was imposed from the top down in all these countries. There is a mania for standardization too. We have the standardization of the German language. We have the imposition of French upon the Occitan-speaking communities in the South, or of Castilian on the Catalan and Basque communities in Spain. There was no brooking dissent. Toleration of dissent was not an Enlightenment value. Now you'll notice that there are two countries missing from this list, Britain and France. Britain had its revolutions in 1649 and 1689. Which resulted in the establishment of a landed / mercantile oligarchy that still governs the country to this day. It escaped the enlightened despot trend. You might even say Charles I and II were enlightened despots before their time. The other country is France, which, despite the best efforts of Louis XIV, still retained its medieval structure, in which the church, the aristocracy, and then the provincial parliaments imposed significant limits on the monarch's central authority, and severely hampered the monarchy's efforts in other cases, which was a large part of what contributed to the crown's budgetary crisis. The French Revolution was a reaction not just against the monarchy, but it was a late adoption of enlightened despotism, just in the form of an anti-monarchical movement. It was enlightened despotism with the ideas of Voltaire and Rousseau. And we can see that we can see this in the adoption of the revolutionary calendar, the 10-hour day. There's a decimal clock there. And then the cult of reason as a new national religion to the exclusion of all others. And you can say Napoleon, who walked back the excesses in a large way, but when he conquered Europe, he imposed constitutions and abolished serfdom in his own legal code. But he was also infamous for his use of spies and secret police. You might call him the last and greatest of the enlightened despots. And of course, Europe reacted to this. There was Romanticism. Europe had had enough of the unfeeling rationality that had killed a large part of the continent, and they focused on the individual. But this was not the individual of the Renaissance, the measured view of the individual as the image and likeness of God. Instead, it was a radical individualism, the individual and the individual emotions taking precedence over anything else. This was the root of the popular revolutions in 1848. And you could say Jacksonian democracy in the USA. But the Enlightenment mania for centralization and standardization didn't go away. And we have the development of positivism by Auguste Comte, which was a view of human society and human history as scientific, completely divorced from any question of theology or religion or moral principle. It was strictly science. And irony of ironies, while communism and fascism both developed as romantic reactions against Enlightenment standardization, they ultimately adopted positivistic outlooks and became, quote unquote, scientific in their outlook. In other words, Marxist theory, there was a scientific development of history that was bound to occur according to a certain methodology, and to fight it was irrational. In the same way, to resist the enlightened despot was irrational. Fascism was largely the same thing, except instead of view of evolution of evolving class, conflict of classes and the evolving of society viewed through the lens of class, it adopted Darwin's view, adopted from Linnaeus, and viewed it through in terms of biological and racial terms. And the 20th century was the crashing of both ideologies. The camps of Eastern Europe, the gulags, the killing fields of Cambodia, all of these are the direct result of the Enlightenment view of reason divorced from moral authority. So where does that leave us today? I want to talk a little bit about utopia. The first utopia is by the great Renaissance humanist St. Thomas More. His utopia describes an ideal society, not of automaton-like humans under strict central supervision, but of individuals in which free discourse is encouraged in the belief that truth itself would prevail by sheer force of its being the truth. His utopia is an organic human society, not a despotism, and it illustrates the Renaissance ideal of reason applied within the context of inherited culture, supplementing rather than supplanting it. The utopia of the Enlightenment, and here we have an illustration of what New Harmony, Indiana, in my own state, was supposed to look like as a utopian community built on Enlightenment principles. Needless to say, it failed miserably. And if you go there today, it looks nothing like that. And then we have the AI techno-utopias being discussed in certain circles today, in which individuals are cogs in a greater scheme, and that they are to be regulated according to those who know better, who follow what they see as principles of reason. But here again, we have procedure over form. Reason is, rather than a means to discovering a greater truth, it is the end in itself. And although the interpretations of what it is vary, the result is the same. There's no brooking of dissent, and there's no room for anything outside the control of those who conceive the idea. So I will conclude there. I didn't do bad on time. And if anyone has any questions, I'm more than happy to address them.
All right. Thank you, Adam. Yeah, that was nice. And I really appreciated what you is often left out, which are these precursors to the thing we call the Renaissance, and that's I think highly undervalued. I didn't know about Justinian. That was news to me, but made a lot of sense. That the Hagia Sophia, you're like, well, what was the movement that was activated that the Hagia Sophia was produced? So to see the political and cultural reforms of Justinian at that time, it made a lot of sense. I find that a fascinating thread. I'm going to continue pulling on it, and all of these different reverberations, these waves hitting the shore. That's as precursors. That's really great. So with that, let's open up the door for some questions. We'll put it wide open here. So if anybody has a question or anything to throw at Adam, even just sharing a thought or an insight, go for it. Or put your name in the chat box and call upon you. Monty there. Yeah, Monty, go for it.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much, Adam. Very, very informative. I really appreciate this. And it brings up a question in my mind, which I haven't really reconciled entirely, but it's an interesting question. You brought up the Council of Florence, which took place in, I think, 1431 to 1435. And that really was the centerpiece for what I think brought about the Renaissance, and so far as bringing all these figures together around Imago Viva Dei, as you talked about. And the centerpiece of this was the Dome of Florence, Brunelleschi's dome, which really represented an artistic achievement and a scientific breakthrough, because a dome like this had never been built before. In other words, they didn't have the wood to build scaffolding. They had to use different scientific principles to do it. So, but what's interesting to me is this just didn't happen out of nowhere. In other words, the Cathedral of Florence was initiated in 1296. That's when it was started. And it took about 150 years to build this cathedral, and it was built through the Dark Ages. And it wasn't until 1418, I think they had a contest, and Brunelleschi won the contest and discovered how to build a dome without scaffolding, and that won it. But what's interesting to me is when this cathedral was initially imagined and the foundations were laid, the dome was imagined. In other words, the foundation had to, and the architecture of it had to have this in mind. So it seems the Renaissance was really planned over a long period of time. It wasn't something that just happened out of nowhere. And the Dark Ages appeared to have interrupted it. So I'd appreciate any thoughts that you might have on this subject.
Well, that's absolutely right. And you bring up a good point. And the same is true for all of the great cathedrals in Europe. They weren't thrown up in a generation even. In fact, the Cologne Cathedral, one of the most beautiful, wasn't completed until the 19th century. And some people will tell you Notre Dame in Paris still isn't complete because there's supposed to be two spires on top of each of the bell towers. Um, so these were not slapdash projects meant to be thrown together for the enjoyment of the current generation, which is what all of modern architecture is. You know, I see these Frank, and I don't want to throw shade on anyone, but I see these Frank Gehry buildings. They'll be useless for anything except scrap in a few generations. The great buildings, including the vision of the cathedral in Florence. This was for God. This was for something eternal and divine. So the timeline didn't matter. What mattered was that we build it to His glory, and our subsequent generations will pick up on this and build on what we have, and this will be something to stand there for eternity. Again, mirroring in creation uh, the Creator, both in terms of eternity and symmetry and proportion and all of that. The cathedrals were, you might say, living embodiments of the conception of God. And yes, exactly. Envisioning this dome, which it wasn't even sure if I guess it's an acknowledgement there that such a thing was possible, even if the right person hadn't come up with the means of achieving it yet. And I think that vision in 1296, that's at the height of the beginnings of the Renaissance. That's when Dante and Boccaccio and Giotto and all these people were living. So, I mean, definitely the vision was there. Definitely they realized this was something they had that humans had the capability for. And it's really an expression of confidence in the human creativity as well. We're going to consider this, and we have faith that this will be done. So yeah, I agree with that completely.
Yes, it's a good lesson today for us to take heed of.
Definitely.
Hey, on a somewhat tangential note, I was just curious in your analysis if this is something you've looked at, but I was looking a little bit at Tertullian, the father of Latin Christianity, and he really went to war with the Greek language. Apparently, like he said, like what do the Greeks have to do with Christianity was one of his famous statements, and he's called the father of Western Christian theology. But the more I look at him, it just seems a little bit shady since the revival and the ideas contained within the Greek lexicon contains the most potent seeds of Renaissance tradition and inspired people like Augustine and others who did write in Latin, but I mean, still he was a student of Greek. So was your view of Tertullian, like I'm getting the sense of him playing a negative anti-Renaissance role in things? Or am I wrong? Like, do you think he did play a positive role in the bigger game?
My limited research into Tertullian, his main contribution to theology was the refutation of Gnosticism, which he played a really important role in. And that's a kind of another when I was in college, the big book was the Da Vinci Code, and that portrayed led to a something of a movement of portraying Gnosticism in a positive light, when really Gnosticism is the opposite of the Renaissance view. Um, it, it it means, and I know you've had presentations that go into this, so I don't need to beat a dead horse here, but yeah, it means that there's a deeper knowledge which only certain people who are able to pierce the veil through that knowledge are able to reach God that way. And Tertullian served an important role in arguing against that. So I think he's compatible with the Renaissance in that way. With his criticism of Greek, I'll confess I'm not that familiar with it. I'd be interested in looking into it, but it may just him being, had a personal beef with somebody and it found its way into his work that way,
Right.
kind of like if you read Saint Jerome, he's a very curmudgeonly man, but an important contributor to theology.
Okay, thank you. Um, on that note, too, one thing to hold that I was noticing too, and then I'll get back on proper topic and get with the questions, is that he became, despite refuting Gnosticism, he joined the Montanists heresy, which were themselves Gnostics, showcasing perhaps a little bit of a
I view him kind of like Origen. He has some writings that became small or orthodox theology, but others that were condemned. I mean, I think that's why he's not a saint, but some of his writings are still. It's one of those, I guess there's some good produced by others who fall into error elsewhere.
Yeah.
Kind of like Origen.
Gotcha. Yeah, David just said I would just mention that Petrarch once described his Renaissance outlook as one of, quote, Greek learning, Latin eloquence, and Christian dogma.
That's great. That's a very good summary of it.
Yeah. Uwe.
Yeah, thank you, Adam. Very interesting angle you threw there on this topic for me, but I wanted to reconfirm my understanding of what you said about the role of the Crusades in opening up the interest for the East and trade with the East and bringing in Greek philosophy and knowledge a second time into this Central European theater. What about the role of Venice in all of this? I mean, this has been also covered a lot by a lot of speakers here, but I wonder whether this whole concept of Crusades and Venice and its connection to Constantinople has something to it.
Yeah, so Venice is a large part of that, and when I talk about the Crusades, it was sort of an unintended secondary effect. What it did was it for purposes of war, but then pilgrims followed in the course of the Crusaders, and it opened up travel routes between Western Europe and the Middle East and beyond. Venice's role in the Fourth Crusade was part of that, which was a disaster from any way you look at it. I mean, it did more to harm Christianity ultimately in the East than it did to help it. But with the sack of Constantinople, it did result in humanist access. It was a little early for the main wave of humanists, but it resulted, I guess, the main result would have been after the Greek recapture of Constantinople, the new emperor Michael VIII wanted to take a very conciliatory tone with the Western powers because he felt more threatened by the Turkish presence in Anatolia. So it was that after effect that led to the Council of Florence and the last great influx of Greek manuscripts from the East. Venice, its role was more commercial more than anything in forming those connections with the East. The Venetians were out, to make money, and they controlled primarily access to the East. And after Genoa was shut out after the fall, the Genoese were huge allies of the Eastern Empire, and after the fall of Constantinople, the Venetians cornered the market on trade in the East, which was a large part of what motivated Spain and Portugal to sail across the Atlantic in search of new trade routes and ultimately finding the Americas. But yeah, Venice's role was commercial more than anything. I don't think it played a significant cultural role. Those were done by the humanists in other places like Florence and Siena and Rome. The Venetians just had the ships and brought the goods in.
So let me, Matt, if I may,
Sure.
have a follow-up question on that.
Sure.
Maybe I was a little bit too polite or something. My question was to the role of the Venetians with respect to the Renaissance, not promotion, but maybe active hindrance of that. So you mentioned the Reformation being a response to or a counter move against the Renaissance, if I understood correctly.
That's correct.
And we know that, or we've been hearing about the Venetian role in the Reformation in bringing about Luther and Zwingli and others, at particular the time they came out. So my question was about the role of Venice in working against what you portrayed as an evolution of the Renaissance.
That's honestly, I couldn't. I'm not. I haven't gone into the details of the Venetian involvement. It wouldn't surprise me though, because the Venetians more than anything were out for themselves. And if they saw a movement that could hamper anything that they felt posed a threat to them, that wouldn't surprise me. I'm afraid I can't answer in greater detail than that, but it's something I certainly would like to look into a little further.
I've got the perfect few things for you, Adam. That's a gift that keeps on giving. It's it's a wild ride if you want to take that journey. But yeah, Venice
I would very
grand
much.
strategy. Okay, I'll send you a few things. Cynthia did a fantastic overview of Schiller's Ghosts here as well, exposing Venetian methods that I'll also throw into the mix with some Webster Tarpley work. But yeah, you'll have fun. Okay,
Okay.
Monty.
Yes, just to follow up on that thought, I believe it was the case that the Black Plague didn't just happen. In other words, all of a sudden, a bunch of rats didn't show up and spread a disease. My understanding is, in fact, there was a default by the King of England on the debt to the Venetians. In other words, there was
no, it was a debt to the Bardi and Peruzzi banking houses, but I do think the Venetians were financial bankrollers behind it. But yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So it much like unto today, we're facing something of a massive blowout, which may very well be planned also behind, in spite of all the things they're putting forth about the reasons for the war we're in. But we're facing something of the same thing. But whether it was planned or not, it appears there was a default on a debt which blew out a financial system, which led to the catastrophic blowout of the actual physical economy and the lack of work and the spread of disease and so forth.
Did that have any connection to the 100 Years' War as well? It wouldn't surprise me if, we all know that one of the first things a government in financial trouble does is go to war.
Yep.
Do you know if that's the case at all?
Yep. Yep. Yeah, no, it's Edward the Third. Yeah, who did both of those things in the same year of the 1348. Yeah, he first defaulted on all of his debts, triggered the banking collapse, and at the same time, yeah, launched the new crusade to take back France.
That makes sense because his claim to the French throne was extremely tenuous.
Well, through Philip le Bel, right, his grandfather, who gave his daughter to Edward II, I believe.
Yeah, but it was through the female line, and the French law of succession was clear. It was as long as there was a male descendant, they had precedence. So he
Yeah.
essentially overlooked French law to assert his claim. So I thought there had to be something more behind it.
You want to hear something else interesting too, as like just for the coincidence theorists out there who like coincidences. 1348 is also the year he unveiled the Order of the Garter, which to this very day is the highest chivalric order of knighthood in the British Empire. Tony Blair's an initiate. Seems like it was modeled on two witch covens because you could only have 24 members at any given time. Oh, sorry, 26 members. With the Prince of Wales at the time, it was the Black Prince being like the head of one of the 13, and the actual reigning monarch is the other head of the other. I really do honestly think of it as a coven, and a lot of occultists today who write about this topic, they all seem to have that same view that this is a Diana cult from the top that managed a lot of the different sects spread across the medieval world. And it was also the same year that you had the Black Plague that was launched in 1348 too. Probably also not a total coincidence.
Well, it was biological warfare was the ultimate cause of the Black Plague. I think that's fairly uncontroversial.
Oh yeah, yeah. Have you found literature that? Because I'm trying to find good quality literature that's not just like the Jews are poisoning the wells, but I do think that it's possible that wells.
This was taught to me in university. Actually,
yeah?
It was in the siege of Caffa, the Genoese outpost in Crimea. And for some reason, I can't remember who the besiegers were. They would throw dead bodies over the wall, infected with the plague, to poison the city. And after the surrender, they returned back, and that's what led to the spread of the plague through northern Italy.
Interesting.
I'll find a source for that, but yeah, that's fairly uncontroversial.
Cool. I mean, horrifying, but cool. Yeah, thank you. All right, Sue.
Hi, thank you, Adam, and thanks, Matt. I hope this isn't too far out in left field, but I just wanted to make more of the link between the Renaissance and the Greco-Roman world. And I'm currently reading a book called Plato and the Creation of the Hebrew Bible by Russell Gmirkin. And he's written 3 books in the series, another one about Timaeus, how that is underpinning Genesis. I haven't received that in the mail yet, so I can't say more about that. But in this book, he outlines how when the 70 or 72 Jewish scholars came to the Library of Alexandria, and what was said to be the translation of the Book of Moses was actually the first writing of the Book of Moses. And then there's other lines of scholarship showing there's no archaeological evidence for Moses prior to this time. There were the archaeology is showing and anthropology is showing that the Jewish people were not following the laws of Moses. And he goes through just showing the laws of Plato and the Constitution of Plato, comparing that to the Pentateuch or the laws of Moses and the Far East laws that had been known. So, which led me to tie in Plato's understanding of God even more directly to Christianity, and Philo of Alexandria and Saint Augustine. And I guess I was just wondering if you've heard of this or investigated this line of scholarship at all, or.
I have heard of the book, just in passing. I haven't really investigated into it. It's an interesting thesis, and I'd be interested, to to see what his line of reasoning is. What's the author's name again?
Gmirkin, Gmirkin. He recently
Oh,
passed away, but yeah.
okay.
But his scholarship is stunning in here. And
Yeah,
when
I
you
got to say, I've listened to a couple of his interviews. I couldn't afford the book at the time when I first saw the interview. It was a bit pricey, but I was impressed by the line of logic. I was unimpressed by his personal disdain for Plato.
right.
At that's always kind of
That's so bad. Yeah.
yeah, it's a bit
Yeah.
off-putting, but I think there were a lot of good points he brought up nonetheless.
Yeah.
The
And when
only
you
thing I would question about that is I believe the Assembly of Jewish Scholars was under the supervision of Ptolemy II in Alexandria, and the Ptolemies as successors of Alexander were Aristotelians. I don't think the Platonists were in particular favor. So I just wonder how he addresses that.
Good point. Yeah, very curious. Very curious.
Yeah, I mean, when you read it through, it's even way more impressive than his
Okay.
talks.
All right.
And they had access to all of the works in the Library of Alexandria, according to Gmirkin. So
Okay. And that's a great question that Adam's got there to just throw in the back of the mind. Yeah, if the Aristotelian doctrine was the hegemonic one under the Ptolemaic leadership of that period, which was, I guess, like what, 170 BC or something, when the
270.
Septuagint was, yeah.
270.
Huh?
270.
Yeah,
270.
270.
270. Oh, 270. Oh, sorry, I have to recalibrate some stuff. Okay. All right. Yeah, stuff to chew on. Okay. All right. Thank you, Sue. That's very cool.
Thank you.
All right, Jerry.
Yeah, better move.
Please don't ask if we can hear you.
Okay, I won't ask if you can hear me, Madeline.
Well, I can hear you, so don't worry.
Okay, all right. Excellent presentation, Adam. Oh, I just
Thank you.
wanted to say, I do agree with you on the beginnings of the Black Death. It was, from what I've read and researched, it was the siege of Kaffa. And it was the Mongols who were besieging the Venetian and Genoese ports, but who were much better. But those were the ports where they conducted the slave trade. The southern Varangians, Vikings, who would, for a living, capture slaves among the southern Slavs around the Black Sea, they were sold to the world at those ports. Kaffa was one of them in the Crimea. So it was a nasty situation, but we ended up with the Black Death out of these two sides fighting over who would control the slave trade. So, but my question, which is more of a comment, but
Thank you for that refresher. Yeah, it's coming back to me. Thank you.
yeah, there was an Italian who was living there at the time who then wrote a report of it, and that's where that comes from. So it's on the scene reporting. But I really appreciated your discussion of the Carolingian Renaissance. And the one comment I made when you were showing the great cathedrals, the Gothic cathedrals, is I really have a dislike of that term Gothic, which was invented by some guy in Britain. I think it was Wren, I'm not sure, but just an arbitrary thing which denigrated the cathedrals. And I think it should be called the Carolingian cathedrals as opposed to Gothic, to really demonstrate that outgrowth of the Carolingian Renaissance, which resulted in these great cathedrals. And so I'm just wondering if I can recruit you to my conspiracy to change the name of Gothic cathedrals and what you think of that.
Oh, I agree with that completely. In fact, I dislike the term Gothic in general, because if you read the history, the Goths themselves were not as barbarous as the term suggests. When the Visigoths settled in Spain, they were one of the few Germanic peoples to keep the Roman infrastructure intact, and in fact, they preserved the aqueducts and the walls and the canals for the Arabs to build off of when they conquered Spain. And they ruled it for 3 centuries before the Arab conquest, and preserved the Roman infrastructure. Same thing in Italy. The Ostrogoths, you know, continued the building of the Byzantine cathedrals in Ravenna. So, while they invaded the Roman Empire and sacked Rome in 411, they ultimately became, one of the more cultured peoples at the time. So the whole idea of Gothic as dark and barbarous and is really a misnomer. Unfortunately, it's become so deeply embedded that when I say it, everyone knows what I'm talking about. But I'll be happy to join your conspiracy.
All right, you got one more for your project there, Jerry. Good. Congratulations. All right, let's open it up we have a small window of time still. If people want to throw in a question at Adam. Jerry, I see your follow-up. You want a follow-up question, Jerry, or is that?
Yes, I want to know, because in my view, one of the renaissances that you left out was the Abbasid Renaissance after the Abbasid Revolution, and the effect that had on, well, that area. And in fact, it was the dynasty before that, the overthrow. One of them somehow survived, and he was the one who made his way to Spain. So he wasn't actually part of the Abbasid Renaissance, even though eventually it did come there. But have you done any work on, because I know the Abbasid Renaissance did have that Greek influence when they set up the House of Wisdom, and brought a lot of the Greek manuscripts to their capital, was it Baghdad, and translated them. But I just wondered if you had done any work on the Abbasid Renaissance itself.
Limited, but yeah, I can speak to that a little bit. And the focus of this presentation was more on Europe. When we talk about the Middle East, it's kind of like China. We're on a different time frame of events there. So the Umayyad dynasty, which was the overthrown one, was based in Damascus, and that was culturally a Greek city, and that was more oriented toward the Mediterranean. When the Abbasids created their new city in Baghdad, it was on the frontier of the Persian Empire. And under the Umayyads, the Persians were kind of an oppressed people, under the thumb of a foreign-speaking ruler. When the Abbasids moved to Baghdad, they incorporated a lot of Persians into their government. And yes, there were Greek manuscripts taken and translated there, but I would say at its height, the Abbasid Caliphate was more Persian influenced than Greek. Now we're still talking about another, millennia old, highly cultured civilization. And Persia before that had, under the Parthian dynasty, it was very, they called themselves Philhellenes, or lovers of Greek culture. So the Greek manuscripts had made it into Persia that way. So I would view the Abbasid as more of a fusion Arab, Persian with a little bit of Greek thrown in there. It was more Eastern looking rather than Western. That's my take on it.
Scott.
Hello. Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me all right?
Correct. Yes.
Yeah, can you hear you?
No? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, okay, so that's starting to get into kind of my question, which is fundamentally this battle, I guess, underlying battle between ancient Greek manuscripts of early Christianity and what became the Romanized translations of even Hebrew script and stuff, and the schism I think that caused in the church. And I'm just wondering, I was raised a Catholic, Roman Catholic, um, and yet and I'm interested and intrigued in the Orthodox Church and its connections, of course, to the Greek scholars like Saint Basil. And I just tend to think, I mean, can you speak to a little bit of this? I mean, you mentioned some of the Platonic church fathers, and if there was any kind of this battle between, script being converted to Greek and somewhere along the way, I don't know the history that the ancient sophisticated Greek was lost, and we have now a modernized reconstructed Greek. But anyway, that's my fascination. Can you speak to that, and maybe you know what might it be the implications for Christianity if the Greek scholarship were more fully developed or channeled out?
Okay. So I'll take the linguistic part first. So yeah, when we talk about ancient Greek, there's classical Greek. Well, and actually classical Greek, there's different dialects. There's Homeric Greek, there's Dorian, which was spoken in Crete and the Peloponnese. There was Boeotian spoken in Thebes. There was Macedonian, which were different dialects of Greek. When we think of classical literary Greek, we're talking about Attic, the language of Athens. Um, that was spoken in the 5th through about the 1st century BC. But Greek, like Latin, changes over time. So classical Greek became Koine Greek, which is what the New Testament was written in originally, and in what the church fathers write, the Greek church fathers wrote. Then there was medieval Greek, which is the language of the Byzantine Empire, and then modern Greek. When Greece became independent in 19th century, there was a debate over whether the Greek language that was for official government use should be classical Greek or what the Greek that was actually spoken on the streets called Demotic. Ultimately, Demotic won out. So modern Greek is about as related to classical Greek as Italian is to Latin. It's a descendant, but a different language. So when we're talking about manuscripts, it's going to depend what period they come from. A manuscript of Plato will be written in classical Attic Greek, a New Testament manuscript in Koine Greek, a manuscript of a Saint Photius or one of the patriarchs talking about scripture will be in medieval Greek. So we're talking about 3 different languages there, essentially. As far as translation of the Bible goes, that was done by Saint Jerome at the request of Pope Damasus I. And what it was, the originals were written in languages that weren't Latin, and they had to either be translated. So what the Pope wanted was an official translation into Latin of those manuscripts so that the Latin-speaking population could understand them, and there wouldn't be different authors' translations. And so what St. Jerome produced was the Vulgate, the Latin Bible, and that still to this day is the official Bible of the Catholic Church. All translations are done from Catholic translations are done from the Vulgate. Now, in more recent editions, they compare them to the manuscripts of the original where they exist. And some of the manuscripts St. Jerome used were since lost. So the Vulgate is really the closest thing we have to the original manuscripts. So when the manuscripts were found, when we're talking about manuscripts being found in the Renaissance, it's non-biblical works. We're talking about Greek philosophy and history, Herodotus, Thucydides, Plato, Aristotle, all of that. When at the Council of Florence and at the previous Council of Lyon, and mind you, in the Byzantine Empire, the Greek versions, were continued to be used in Greek. So when the councils convened and you had the Greek and the Latin Bible being compared, there really weren't any significant disagreements over what the very different language versions of the Bible actually said. So I don't see any linguistic controversy there. Did I address everything you wanted to ask about there?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, just yeah, an overview of the history of how we go from the Greek and the evolution of Greek, and then into the Latin formations. And if there were any kind of like Greek purists who wanted to maintain the Greek, that's a curiosity of me. But and I guess maybe the and another side question would be, did that translation work affect Latin itself?
No, but I would but I will.
That you know of.
I will address, it's called the Vulgate because in Latin vulgatus vulgus, from which we get our word vulgar, means crowd or the common people. So St. Jerome's translation was in a less refined version of Latin than you would see in, say, Cicero or Seneca. It's less grammatically complex, less poetic, and more direct, but that reflects the Koine Greek of the originals, because the Greek of that was a less flowery, less grammatically complex version of classical Greek. So I would say the Latin used in the Vulgate Bible it parallels the Greek. And then when we're talking about Latin, there's again a difference between classical and ecclesiastical. Ecclesiastical Latin is less flowery. It's the same rules of grammar, but less grammatically complex, and the pronunciation is different. It's closer to Italian than what classical Latin pronunciation would be. So I wouldn't say that was affected by the Latin translation of the Bible, but I would say the difference shows up in the translation.
Okay.
I have a thing for languages and linguistics, if you couldn't tell.
Yeah, I studied linguistics in university, and I kind of I fell in love with it, and I think it's a bit of a science on its own, and into our thinking, and so thanks for that answer. Yeah, thanks for
Absolutely.
I've been looking at and here I know we got to round it out here, but I just got to get it off my chest. I've been looking into this character Raymond Lull quite a bit lately. He's come into my research from every direction. I keep on bumping into this guy as having inspired Cusa, as having inspired Leibniz, of having like been one of these like driving minds of the I think he died in 1316 or something, who really gave rise to so much of the Renaissance. And I was wondering if he's a character you've looked at in your research as well, or
Oh yeah, he was Spanish. He was from Catalonia. I've heard his name mentioned, but I honestly I don't know much about him. I'd be curious to look into it.
Yeah, it seems like he was playing a role to take down the Templars too, which I'm just sort of yeah. Anyway, okay, I'll keep you posted as I scratch away. All right.
Sure.
So you've given us all a lot. Thank you so much for this wonderful buffet of thoughts of ideas that we definitely need. I think in this desert wasteland culturally, where this feast of ideas is generally not permitted. So I really appreciate you giving us this bounty and a lot to work with, a lot of leads to follow up on. So thank you everybody for joining us. Adam, do you have any of your work published? I know you published with Dave on the New Liar. A lot of your works are there, as well as sometimes he'll post some of your stuff. I'll see your essays and some of your poetry on his Age of Muses and a few websites. Like I think I've seen you on the Imaginative Conservative. But where do you publish? How do people read more of your stuff?
So if you like to read my poetry, I have 6 books of poetry out there. They're all available on Amazon. Um, under my name. My essays are out there. There's some in New Liar and its predecessor publications. I have published in the Imaginative Conservative. Society of Classical Poets is another source where I publish both poetry and essays. And then I do publish fiction with the New Liar as well. I'll have some new works coming out on that, but I would like to gather my essays into another volume soon. When I get around to it, you'll be the first to know.
All right. Thank you. All right. So I'll have a few links to your written works. And next week, I think we have Magdalena, who is scheduled for her part 2. So stay tuned for that. I'll make sure that that Magdalena's part 1 on the very fishy character Edward VII was exposed in full gory detail, and she's going to pick up where she left off, going into another dimension of the shenanigans of both Edward VII and broader British intelligence operations behind so many of the travesties of the turn of the 20th century that impact our current day in ways that you can't even imagine. So that'll be next Sunday, 2 p.m. Thank you, everybody, and thank you, Adam, so much. Till next week.
Thank you.